Ever since this quarantine has started, one of the things that I've missed the most about it's not just in not being able to worship together and take the Lord's Supper together in person in the same building. One of the things that I've missed is being around each other. And several churches have tried to do different things to kind of, I don't know, say fill that gap, but try to do something kind of in the intermediary in between those times. And one of the things that we've done at Hillside is we've started a study that happens in our private group, our private Hillside members only group at 9 a.m. every morning, every weekday morning at 9 a.m. And Dustin Kinnison, one of our members right now, is teaching it actually on David and the Psalms and doing a fantastic job with that. Before him, what we discussed was, I think, 3.5 weeks on the parables. And we went in depth on all the parables, at least as much as we could in 3.5 weeks. And there was a few of them that obviously all of them we have read hundreds of times. There are a few of them that really kind of stood out in my mind. And one of them was the parable of the talents. And so I'd encourage you, if you haven't opened up your Bibles yet, go ahead and open them up to Matthew chapter 25, because I want to read the parable of the talents. I want to step through it. I want to make some applications for us today and answer one big question that's lingering in my mind that I never really thought about outside of a few weeks ago as it pertains to this parable. Just to kind of set the stage for what we're dealing with here. When you look at Matthew chapter 25, this is the second chapter of a two-chapter section that answers questions that the apostles had had. If you look back, I think chapter 21, 22 is when Jesus enters into Jerusalem. It's a triumphal entry. And then he spends some time in chapter 22 answering questions with the Pharisees and Sadducees. Chapter 23 is his blistering 8-woe rebuke towards the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. When you get to chapter 24, that's when it opens up with 3 questions as Jesus is looking at the temple and he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's talking about the end of the world. The apostles have questions, obviously, as anybody would. And the beginning of Matthew chapter 24, they have 3 questions specifically. They say, Lord, what is the signs of these things? What is the sign of the end of the coming? And what is the sign of the end of the age? And so throughout chapters 24 and 25, Jesus answers all 3 of those questions, or 2 questions, if you feel that that's just 2 questions. He answers those questions. And in chapter 24, his big point that he really tries to drive home is the idea that we need to be ready. That no matter the hour, that no matter what time it is, we always need to be ready for his return. And you see that bleed over into chapter 25 with the parable of the 10 virgins, how these are women that were not ready whenever the bridegroom showed up. They didn't have enough oil, and so they were shut out of the marriage feast because they, quite frankly, just weren't ready. And so out of that idea of being ready goes into Matthew chapter 25, this parable of the talents. And he strikes this same chord, albeit through kind of a different mechanism, when he talks about the idea of being ready, not just in waiting and making sure that you're prepared, but making sure that you're using the most of your time that you have right now. And that's kind of the focal point of Matthew chapter 25. So I want to look at starting in verse 14. This is when the parable begins. We're going to read all the way down through verse 28. It says, For it is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And then he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who had received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, verse 19, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. And the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you have entrusted 5 talents to me. You have entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, verse 21, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Verse 22, Also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, verse 23, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. The one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent on the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew that I reaped where I did not sow, and gathered where I scattered no seed, and then you ought to have put my money in the bank. And on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. This parable is probably not unfamiliar to the vast majority of the people that are listening to this lesson right now. But if it is the first time that you're listening to it, I want to step through it and notice a few things. I want you to notice first and foremost that when the master went on his journey, growth was not only hoped for, but growth was expected. It wasn't uncommon in that day and age for somebody who was in possession of any kind of wealth, and especially who had servants under his command, to distribute some of the wealth to their servants and then go off on a distant journey. After all, it was much safer in their hands than it probably would have been in the bank, or leaving it in a hole in the ground, or whatever the situation may be, because you can easily just go up and dig it up and steal it, or whatever it is. And so to give it to your slaves or give it to your servants was an expectation that not only would they keep it safe, which is what the 1 talent man did, but they would also build upon that. There was always that expectation of it. And you can see this kind of built into the parable itself, because as soon as the 5 talent man receives his 5 talents, it says specifically that he immediately went away and earned 5 more talents. The 2 talent man immediately went away and earned 2 more talents. And so there's no hesitation on either of these 2 men's parts, or these 2 servants' part, that as soon as they received their respective talents, they then went out and actually did something with that. So I want you to notice in this parable, first and foremost, that growth was expected. I want you to notice also that the talents were different. And there's been a lot of people that have made hay with this, where they've talked about, he gave this one to this person, this person, this person. He gave one to this person, because he just didn't respect that person. And I don't think that's in view here at all. Because when you look at what he mentioned specifically there in the parable, he says he gave talents to each one of them as they had, or according to their own ability. That's not to say that this person is more trustworthy, that he's more responsible, that he necessarily is a better person. It just means that he divided up his talents as each one had their ability. And I think something that gets lost in the shuffle in this parable is that to give any talent to any person is a monumental source of responsibility. A talent is a gigantic amount of money. A talent is actually not really a currency as much as it is a measurement of weight. That's how they often did currency back then. And so to give somebody a talent, this kind of measurement of weight, depending on the value, could be anywhere between a few $1,000s, and some people have speculated even into the millions or even into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, I don't think 1 talent was necessarily worth hundreds of millions, but the point that I'm getting at here is that all of these people were given a certain amount of responsibility, and all of them were given a lot of responsibility. Whether you've got 5 talents, whether you've got 1 talent, you're still responsible for several thousands at least worth of money. I want you to notice something else. Number 3, that the reward was exactly the same. Sometimes when we just read it kind of in one sitting as we just did, we miss or we gloss over the fact that the response from the master to both the 5 talent and the 2 talent man was exactly the same. He said, word for word, "Well done, thou good and faithful slave, enter into the joy of your master." Says the exact same thing to the 5 talent man, says the exact same thing to the 2 talent man. In other words, what doesn't matter is what they were given. It doesn't really even matter that they produced more than what they had back. The 5 talent man produces 5. The 2 talent man produces 2. And so it doesn't really matter that the 2 talent person only produced 2, whereas the 5 talent person produced 5. That doesn't matter, because both of them had the exact same type of reward. And so I think sometimes when we look at our own lives, we think, well, I can't do this, I can't do this. And we think to ourselves that God's not going to be well pleased with my little area of the world that I'm influencing, or my little area of the kingdom that I'm really having an impact on. And that doesn't matter, because to both of these people, he said, "Well done, thou good and faithful slave, enter into the joy of your master." He did not make any delineation between the 5 and the 2 talent man. Which then begs the question, what happened to the 1 talent man? I think when you look at this parable, the 5 and the 2 talent man represent different areas of expertise. They represent different skill levels. They represent different areas that these people worked in. And there's a difference in talents and difference in distribution. But the 1 talent man was not that far behind the 2 talent man. And so it would have been easy to think that he could have gone out and done much the exact same type of thing. And this story would look totally different if the 1 talent man comes back to his master and says, "See, you gave me 1 talent, I gave you 1 more. But that's not what happened. So I want to ask you the question, especially as you look at this parable for either the first time or the 1,000th time, I want to ask you the question, what happened with the 1 talent man? I want you to notice first and foremost that as you look at this parable, that this 1 talent man doesn't immediately rationalize away his decision. What he does is he blames it on the master. I want you to look back at Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 24. I want you to notice what he says to this person. He says in verse 24, "I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed." And so what this person does, this 1 talent person does, is he blames his inaction on a fear of the master. And then in verse 25, he says, "I was afraid. I went away and hid your talent on the ground. See, you have what is yours." And all of us, to a certain extent in our own lives, have a healthy respect and a reverence and a fear of God. He is the creator of the universe. And so all of us have that kind of natural fear towards our creator, which is what this parable is personifying between the master and slave. And so the slave looks at the master and says, the reason I didn't do anything with it is because I knew that you are a really harsh taskmaster, that you demand a lot of your people. Notice, however, that they didn't stop the other two guys. The 5 and the 2 talent man, it didn't stop them, but it did the first person, or the 1 talent man. And what you learn, and this is the point of this, the answer to the question, at least in my opinion, of where the 1 talent man went wrong, the answer to that question is he was so afraid of doing what was wrong that it failed to do what was right. I want to say that again. The 1 talent man was so afraid of doing something wrong that he failed to do what was right. As you think about this, it's easy for us to look at this parable and say, I can't believe this 1 talent man didn't go out and make more talents. I can't believe he didn't build on the stewardship that was entrusted in from the master. But I want to ask you real quick, does this define me? You know, the etymology of the word talent, where we get it in the English, that word talent, comes from this parable. It comes from the idea that you have been given something by God. You've been giving a stewardship of something by God, and now it's your responsibility to take that thing, that talent, that skill, that ability, whatever it is, your resources, whatever it is, and go make more of it. Use it in some form or fashion. And so ask yourself, as you look at this parable, does this define me? Am I so afraid in the kingdom of doing something that is going to anger God that I never even go out in the first place? And I'll tell you how this finds its embodiment. How this finds its embodiment in our own lives is we say, well, I'm not going to go up and talk to somebody about their sin because I'm afraid that I'll just drive them away from the church. And so I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to do anything. And somebody will say, well, I'm so afraid of going and talking to my neighbor about the gospel because I feel like I'll mess it up somehow. I feel like I won't say the right words. I won't use the right verses. And so in order to not mess up, I'm just not going to do anything right now. And we let our fear of doing something wrong stop us from doing what we know is absolutely right. It's that fear of failure that is embodied in this 1 talent man. And I would argue can be embodied in us, even without sometimes us even recognizing this. You know, most of us are aware of who Babe Ruth is. I'm a big baseball dude. So Babe Ruth is somebody that I'm very familiar with. And Babe Ruth, for a long period of time, was called the home run king. Still is called the home run king in certain circles. And that's because he hit and held the record for a long time, a career home run total of 714 home runs, a record that was only broken by the great Hank Aaron when he hit number 715. What we don't oftentimes know about Babe Ruth, and what often gets lost in the story, is that he was also the record holder for strikeouts in a career. As a matter of fact, he held the record for strikeouts with 1,330 career strikeouts over his career until Mickey Mantle broke it in the late 50s. He held that record for almost 30 years. But we don't think about Babe Ruth as being the strikeout king. We think of him as being the home run king. And he was somebody that when people asked him, why is it that you strike out so much? Because before he came into the big leagues, people really didn't strike out. It was kind of a different game then. They didn't try to strike out. And of course, nobody tries to strike out, but no, he didn't strike out as much. So Babe Ruth kind of set the standard for that for the next 30 years. And they asked Babe Ruth, why do you strike out so much? And he said, I just keep swinging because every strike brings me closer to a home run. I think that's a fantastic attitude for us to have in our life. We're so terrified sometimes of failure, of doing something wrong, that we never end up getting around to doing what we know we should be doing because we're so afraid of failure. And let me give you a thought that hopefully will be very liberating as we move forward in this lesson and as you move forward in your life. God does not care about successes and failures in the same way that we do. You know, if we look at things in our life and we measure somebody leaving the church or driving somebody away, and we see that as a cold failure in our life. I talked to somebody about their sin, the example we just mentioned. I talked to somebody about their sin, and I drove them away. We see that as a failure. And what we don't sometimes see is, number one, that we fulfilled our responsibility to go and talk to them. But what we may not see is down the road, maybe that person recognizes what you talked to them about. They make the corrections in their life, and they come back to God, maybe 10, 20, 30, 50 years down the road. So God does not define failure and success in the same way that we do. But what God cares about, and we'll talk about this more here in just a second, what God cares about is that we try. That's what God really wants us for us to have. I think you see this in the master's response. I want you to notice a few things. I want you to notice first and foremost that the master's response is jarring, that he talks about how inaction produces laziness. When you look at the response that this master had towards this slave, the first thing that he says is, "You wicked slave." Now, obviously, that's understood. He didn't really do anything with his time. But he says, "You wicked and you lazy slave." There's no doubt about it, ladies and gentlemen, that using our talents in this world is really tough. That if you have a talent in one area, or if you have a talent in this area, it's hard for us sometimes to go out into the world and use those talents, because it's so much easier for us to just kind of float, for us to just kind of move and kind of exist and live in this world and kind of sit on autopilot. And to step out into the deep and say, I'm going to use my talent that I feel like God has given me, that I've developed, and I'm going to use it in this way, that can be scary. And that fear sometimes, just like it did with this one talent man, produces an inaction within us. I want you to look in the book of Proverbs real quick. Look at Proverbs chapter 26. Solomon has a lot to say with this idea. Proverbs chapter 26. In Proverbs chapter 26, starting in verse 13. It's hard sometimes to get these parables to kind of work together, but I think you see a unit here in Proverbs chapter 26 that speaks volumes about our topic that we're discussing right now. Proverbs chapter 26, starting in verse 13. It says, "The sluggard says, there's a lion in the road. A lion is in the open square. As the door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He is weary of bringing it to his mouth again." And then in verse 16 he says, "The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can give a discreet answer." When Solomon talks about the sluggard here in Proverbs chapter 26, he talks about all these different excuses that these people give. The person lies on his bed, the sluggard lies on his bed, and looks out and says, "There's a lion in the road. I can't do anything today." And then he says, as a door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard turn on his bed. The only thing he knows, and the biggest action and the most laborious thing he's going to do that day, is just kind of roll over to get more comfortable. And then you look at verse 25, the sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He's weary of bringing it to his mouth again, that he can't even muster up the energy to pull his hand back out with the food that's right there and eat it, because he's too lazy to do even that. And I love the way that Solomon bookends this. We missed verse 12 earlier, but look at verse 12. He says, "Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him." Verse 16 says the exact same thing. "The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can give a discreet answer." Why is it that those two verses bookend this idea of laziness? Why does he put those two verses on the side of when he talks about somebody who makes excuses? There's a lion in the road. Or I'm too lazy to pull food out of the dish and bring it to my mouth. Why does he use that? And I would argue that, at least in part, the reason that he mentions that is because for somebody who is disposed to this, somebody who is a sluggard, somebody who just lays around, every excuse in the world is good enough for them to not do anything. They can rationalize it all day long. They can rationalize the inaction. They can rationalize not doing this because, after all, there's a lion in the road. And you'll notice that lazy people are really good at making excuses. When I'm lazy in my own life and I just don't want to do something, I become all of a sudden the best in the world at making excuses for why that doesn't work. And it's easy for somebody sitting on a pew or sitting on a chair to armchair quarterback somebody else's actions and sit there and say, well, that's not going to work, you might as well not even try. Or that's not going to work, you might as well not even try. That's the attitude of Proverbs chapter 26 of the sluggard who rationalizes in his own mind why acting on anything is a waste of time. And that's what this one talent man had done. This one talent man had looked at the master and said, you're a hard person to deal with. You expect reaping where there's not really even sowing. You're a tough person. And so instead of doing anything, I'm just going to do the bare minimum and keep my one talent safe. I think when we look at our life, when we look at our duties and our responsibilities and our talents that we have towards God, I think a certain amount of naivete, however that word is pronounced, needs to come into play. You know, Richard Branson, who started the Virgin Empire, has something like 300 different industries that he works in. His motto, one of the things that he lives by, is ignorance is bliss. The fact that he doesn't know everything that he needs to know to get into an industry, and that actually he views as a benefit. Because if he knew every step of the way, if he knew every hurdle, everything that he would have to overcome, then he would have never gotten started in the first place. And that's the same way it is with us. If we knew at the outset that this person that we're trying to evangelize to is going to be tough, that we're going to have to overcome this, that we're going to have to overcome this, that we're going to have to spend years talking to this person, then we might not ever get started in the first place. And so that inaction, that laziness that's bred out of a result of inaction, comes from rationalizing these things away. And that's exactly what the one-talent person did, is he saw all the problems with every path forward, and he decided that the best course of action was to just not do anything. You can almost imagine the conversations he was having in his mind, because however long this person was on this journey for, this master was on this journey for, he's sitting at home looking at his one talent and thinking to himself, when he comes back and asks why I didn't do anything, this is what I'm going to say. This is what I'm going to say. This is what I'm going to say. And a lot of us are having those conversations in our head right now about Judgment Day. That we know we have these resources, we know we have these talents, these abilities, these paths forward, but when God asks us on Judgment Day why we didn't pursue any of them, we have excuses at the ready. And God's going to look at us the same way that that master looked at that slave. You wicked and lazy slave. He could say that about me. He could say that about any of us. I want you to notice something else about this. Another lesson I think that we can learn from this. What we realize in looking at the parable of the talents is that doing anything is better than doing nothing. To me, this is one of the strongest points to pull out of this, because when this slave looks at this master and he says, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you didn't sow, taking where you didn't plant any seed. I knew that you were a hard man, and so I didn't do anything. And what the master says back to him after he scolds him for his inaction is he says, you should have at least taken my money and put it in the bank, and then I could have done something with it. And so what we find out from at least that principle right there is that the bare minimum, the absolute bare minimum that he could have done with his talent is gain at least 1 or 2% back on that. Doing anything is better than doing nothing. What we need to realize, and this is what we talked about a second ago, is that what God cares about is not successes and failures in the way that we measure successes and failures. What God cares about is that we try, that we're doing the best we can with what we have. And I don't mean to sound all frou-frou when I say that God doesn't care about the outcome of our events. That's not to say. What I am saying is that sometimes we're so obsessed with what the end result is that we don't even get started in the first place, when doing anything is better than doing nothing, which is where we're at right now. I want you to look in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Just because we can't see the tangible success doesn't mean it isn't there. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, I think you see a little bit of this in verse 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, starting in verse 10, there's some of these principles found in this passage that I think will give you some comfort. Because a lot of us, as we mentioned, we view successes and failures in a very tangible format. I can't do this, therefore I'm not very good. I'm not even going to start. But notice what Paul says to this church. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, starting in verse 10, talking about their financial support of him, their support of his work. In verse 10, he says, I give my opinion in this matter. For this is to your advantage, who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do it, which I would argue the desire is important. It's probably more important than the opportunity. But now finish, verse 11, doing it also, so that just as there was the readiness to desire it, so there also may be the completion of it by your ability. For if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. If you highlight or underline in your Bible, I want you to look at that verse specifically. I want to read it again. Is if the readiness is present, verse 12, is acceptable according to what a person has and not according to what he does not have. It's very easy for us to say, I don't have this, therefore I can't act. When that's not what God cares about. As he would mention in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, if we say, I'm not a hand, therefore I can't do this. I'm not a foot, therefore I can't do that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make what you're doing any the less of it. When you think about the poor widow who put in 2 mites, which is the smallest coin that's humanly possible, that nobody would have even noticed if it was there or wasn't there. If that widow had had the attitude of, well, it's only 2 mites and I can't contribute because it's not really going to do anything, if she had laid it back, then we wouldn't have that story. But do you remember what Jesus said about it? Jesus said she has put in more than everybody else because she put in everything she had. Tabitha, in Acts chapter 9, is sandwiched in between the fantastic story of Saul's conversion and the story of Cornelius' conversion in Acts chapter 10. And yet Tabitha, the poor woman that made blankets for everybody, created an enormous impact in her community and amongst her friends and amongst her family and amongst her community members. And it meant a lot to those people. And we think that just because we're not a Peter, we're not a Paul, we're not a Cornelius, we're not an apostle, that we can't do these amazing things, when that doesn't matter. What matters is whether or not we're making the most of what we have in our life to the best ability that we have in the kingdom. Jump one more chapter in chapter 9, starting in verse 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, starting verse 6. Now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must do also just as he has just purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed, as it is written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, and yet his righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. You know what that passage talks about? You get it started, God's going to help you along the way. And I can bring up hundreds of stories, and you could probably bring up thousands more of people that started down a path, not really knowing where it was going to go. They thought they were going to do this. And they thought, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll be able to achieve this. And then it went in a drastically different direction, and look at the fruit of that. Which brings to mind, by the way, another parable, Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the seed, the parable of the sower, who scatters seed everywhere, but the seed that falls in the good soil springs up 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 times, which is a magnificent crop for a seed that was thrown just kind of carelessly everywhere. The point of all of that is get started. And you don't know what's going to happen at the end. But if we prejudge our results, if we prejudge our actions and say, this isn't going to amount to much, therefore I'm not going to get started, we can rationalize it towards God all we want, but that doesn't change the fact that we didn't do anything. When doing something is better than doing anything. I want you to notice also one more point, Matthew chapter 25. We left out this last section deliberately because I wanted to keep it for right here. Matthew chapter 25, the end of this parable. I want you to notice what is said here at the end of Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 29. This is after the master has done talking, gives away the 1 talent from him, gives it to the one who has 10 talents. Look at verse 29. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness, and that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What we learn from this passage, what we learn from these last 2 verses, is that responsibility is cumulative. What we notice from this passage is that the person who is exercising great stewardship over what they have, more responsibility somehow naturally finds its way into their hands. And now I think when you look at this, you have several different applications. You have this from a Jewish perspective. The Jews were looking at their last 1,000, 2,000 years of history with God, where they kind of went up and down, they were obedient, they were disobedient. And it's obvious from what Paul talks about in the book of Romans that the Gentiles now are going to inherit the kingdom alongside them. The Jews were probably not the best stewards of it. I think you see that from the parable, for instance, of the wicked vine dresser. But the Jews were not the best stewards of it. But it was always in the plan anyways to introduce Gentiles into it. And so from a Jewish perspective, I think you can look at their lack of stewardship over the kingdom already at that point. I think you also can see in a strictly literal sense, we can see the progression in our lives. If we are good stewards in our life in this world, or in this life, we'll have the home in heaven there in the life thereafter. I think you see that as well. That if we're obedient to God now, we have that home in heaven with him. But I think you also see it in a church sense. I think a lot of churches look around and they ask themselves, why is it that we're not growing? Why is it that we don't have more people coming through our doors? Why are we not getting more studies? And I think in some ways, maybe it's because we're not making the most of what we already have. Now, this is by no means to say that big churches are doing everything right and small churches are not doing anything right. That's not at all what I'm talking about. What I am addressing is the fact that sometimes in order to get more responsibility, we have to look at what we've been given, our resources, our opportunities right now, and make the most of those that we already have. What we do know, what we realize from the story of the parable of the talents, is that growth and responsibility is cumulative. It continues to build on each other. If I'm good in this area, if I've exercised stewardship and discipline in this area, I can expect more stewardship and more discipline and more obedience and more opportunities to come as I make the most of what I have now. I love what Thomas Edison said, and I'll leave you with this. Thomas Edison said, many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up. I think most of us look at our lives and we think to ourselves, I can't do this. This is not going to work. None of this is even going to matter, so why do we even try in the first place? And what we don't realize is just how close we are to success if we just keep pushing forward in the kingdom. If we just work a little bit harder, if we just seize those opportunities that we see right in front of us, make the most of what we have. I think what we'll realize is how close we are to success. Let's bow together as we end this lesson. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for the opportunities that you've given to us. We're thankful, Lord, for the blessings that you give us in our life, the opportunities we have to spread the gospel, to be obedient to you, to help one another get to heaven. We're thankful, Lord, for this opportunity of technology where we can reach so many people with your word. We pray, Lord, that we'd be such good stewards of it. We pray, Lord, that you would help us to not have the fear that we sometimes have in our life, where we're crippled by inaction, by laziness, because we're so terrified of not succeeding. We pray, Lord, that you would give us the strength and the confidence and the courage, not only to push forward, but also to trust in you, that your purpose and your plan, and that your goals will eventually be met. We pray, Lord, that you help us to be good stewards in that plan. Help us to be instruments and tools in your service, that we can help other people come to you and help other people understand the gospel. Give us strength, give us courage, and give us drive, Lord. These things we pray in your Son's name.